"Grandpa, the targets are at 600 yards. You're not going to see them, let alone hit them." That was the sentence that hung in the cold morning air at the rifle range outside Cedar Falls, Iowa, on a Saturday in October. The man it was aimed at was 78 years old, stood 5'8" in worn boots, and was carefully laying a battered walnut-stocked M1 Garand onto the shooting mat. The rifle had a serial number stamped in 1944. The old man had no scope, no bipod, no muzzle brake, no range-finding turret to spin. He had a rear aperture sight the size of a pencil eraser and a front post the width of a matchstick. Around him, 15 young shooters in tactical caps stood behind their custom bolt-action rifles. Surgeon actions, Bartlein barrels, glass-bedded stocks, optics worth more than some of their cars. They smirked. They elbowed each other. One of them filmed him on a phone. The old man heard every word, every laugh. He didn't look up. He didn't speak. He thumbed 8 rounds into an en-bloc clip with hands that had done the motion more times than most of those boys had drawn breath. And then the match director walked out of the tower, took one look at the rifle, took one look at the shooter, and froze in the middle of the firing line. If you believe that real respect is something you earn in silence and not something you demand with a loud voice, type the word "honor" in the comments before this story goes any further. Because what happened at that range over the next 40 minutes is something every young shooter in America should hear at least once in their life. His name was Walter Hennessy, and almost nobody at the range that day knew it. He drove a 1998 Ford pickup the colour of dust. He wore a faded green field jacket that had seen more winters than most of the shooters had been alive. He lived alone now, in a small house on the edge of town, in the same kitchen where his wife Eleanor had made coffee every morning for 41 years, before the cancer took her in the spring of 2019. Walter didn't talk much anymore. He fed the birds, he read history books, and once a month on the Saturday closest to the new moon, he drove 90 minutes to the precision long-range match, because Eleanor, on the night before she died, had made him promise that he would not stop shooting. "Don't you dare put that rifle in a closet, Walt," she had said. "That rifle is who you are." So he kept his promise. He showed up. He paid his entry fee. He said good morning to the range officers, and he shot his old Garand, the same rifle that had once belonged to a corporal named Thomas Hennessy, on a hillside in northern France in the autumn of 1944. Walter's father, who had carried it home in pieces and rebuilt it on a kitchen table in Dubuque after the war, and had given it to his son the day Walter graduated boot camp at Parris Island in 1967. The match that morning was a 600-yard precision event, the longest stage of the season. The targets were small. The wind was a swirling, gusting nuisance that pushed across the prairie at an angle no spotter scope could quite predict. The young men on the line had been preparing for weeks. They had ballistic calculators on their phones. They had Kestrel weather meters clipped to their belts. They had laser rangefinders, even though the distance to the target was already known and posted on the scoreboard. They were good shooters, most of them. Several of them were former competitive shooters from college teams. A few were active duty soldiers home on leave. They were not bad people. They were just young, and they did not yet understand that there are men who walk among us whose names will never appear on a billboard, but whose hands have shaped the very disciplines those young men were now practicing. The boy who had made the comment about Walter not being able to see the target was named Tyler. He was 24. He had a custom rifle that cost $4,200. He had never failed to clean a target at 600 yards in competition, and he was very, very proud of that. Walter heard the comment and let it pass over him the way a stone in a river lets the water go around it. He had heard worse, in worse places, from people who meant it more. He had stood under monsoon rain in Ecorse in 1968, with a corporal screaming in his ear that he was going to die in Vietnam if he didn't move faster, and he had not moved faster, and he had not died. He had stood on the firing line at Camp Perry in 1979, and listened to a New York Times reporter tell him that service rifle marksmanship was a dying art with no place in the modern military, and he had smiled politely and shot a 198 out of 200 the next morning to take the President's 100. He had stood in front of 300 young Marines at Quantico in 1985 and watched them decide by their faces alone that the small greying gunnery sergeant in front of them probably did not know what he was talking about, and he had taken the worst shooter in the room, a private named Delgado from El Paso, who could not group inside 10 inches at 200 yards, and 3 weeks later that private was punching the X-ring at 500. Tyler's comment about a 600-yard target was a small thing. Walter had been hearing small things for 60 years. The match director that morning was a man named Raymond Baker. He was 56 years old, retired Marine Corps, and a distinguished rifleman with the Distinguished Rifleman Badge, one of the highest honours in American competitive shooting, awarded only to those who have earned 30 hard-won points in the sanctioned excellence in competition matches over a career. Ray Baker had earned his badge in 1996. He ran the Cedar Falls range now because he loved the sport and because his wife wanted him out of the house on Saturdays. He was a serious man, but a friendly one. He walked the line every match to greet the shooters, check their equipment, and make sure the safety procedures were being followed. He had walked past Walter Hennessy's lane probably 4 or 5 times in the past year, and he had nodded politely the way he nodded to everyone, and he had never once looked at the rifle on Walter's bench. That morning, for some reason, maybe the way the early light caught the wood of the stock, maybe the way Walter was loading the on-block clip with his thumb in the precise position taught in a manual Ray Baker himself had read 40 times as a young Marine. That morning, Ray Baker stopped. He stopped, and he looked, and the colour left his face. He took 2 slow steps closer to Walter's bench. He looked at the rifle. He looked at the way the rear aperture had been polished by decades of fingertips. He looked at the small, almost invisible engraving on the receiver heel, an engraving so faint it took a man who knew exactly what he was looking for to find it. And then Ray Baker straightened his back, and his hand came up in a salute that he had not given on a civilian rifle range in 20 years of running matches. "Master Gunnery Sergeant Hennessy," he said, and his voice carried clear across the firing line in the sudden silence. "Sir, I did not know you were here today. I would have met you at the gate." The young shooters down the line began to turn their heads. Tyler lowered his phone. Walter Hennessy looked up from his clip, and a small, tired smile crossed his face. "Stand easy, Gunny," he said quietly. "I'm just here to shoot." But Ray Baker did not stand easy. He turned, and he raised his voice so that every shooter on that line could hear him, and he spoke the words that none of those young men would ever forget. "Gentlemen, ladies, I want everyone to put their rifles on safe and turn this way for one moment. The man on lane 7 is Master Gunnery Sergeant Walter J. Hennessy, United States Marine Corps, retired. He served 3 tours in Vietnam. He earned the Bronze Star with Valor at Khe Sanh. He was the senior marksmanship instructor at Marine Corps Base Quantico from 1981 to 1991. He won the Wimbledon Cup at Camp Perry in 1979 and again in 1983. He was a member of the All-Marine Rifle Team for 9 consecutive years. He earned the Distinguished Rifleman Badge in 1976, 5 years before I was old enough to enlist. And gentlemen, he wrote the United States Marine Corps Service Rifle Marksmanship Manual, the 1984 revision, the one some of you trained out of when you were learning to shoot iron sights as recruits, sir. Ray Baker turned back to Walter, and his voice softened. "Sir, you wrote the manual. You wrote the manual that taught me to shoot the rifle I just earned my badge with, and nobody on this line, including me, is fit to give you advice on a 600-yard target. With your permission, sir, we'd like the honour of watching you shoot." The silence on that range was the deepest silence those young men had ever stood in. Tyler's phone was in his pocket now. He had not put it there consciously. It had fallen there, the way things fall when a hand forgets it is holding them. The young shooter next to him, a college senior named Marcus, had taken off his cap. He did not remember doing it. The wind moved across the prairie and lifted the corner of an American flag at the edge of the range, and the rope clinked once against the pole, and that was the only sound for what felt like a very long time. Walter Hennessy looked at Ray Baker, and his eyes were wet, but his hands were perfectly still. "You give me too much credit, Gunny," he said. "I just wrote down what better men taught me." Then he turned back to his rifle, slid the on-block clip into the receiver, with a smooth, practiced motion of a man who had loaded that rifle perhaps 50,000 times in his life, and he said, very quietly, "Let's see if the old girl still remembers." He shouldered the Garand. He found his natural point of aim by closing his eyes, breathing twice and opening them again, the technique he himself had described on page 47 of the manual that Ray Baker had named. He squeezed the trigger. The Garand barked, the brass arced, the bolts slammed home. 600 yards downrange, a target marker rose from the pits and indicated the X-ring. The young men on the line, who a moment earlier had been smirking, exhaled as one. Walter fired again. X. Again. X. Again. X. He shot 8 rounds without removing the rifle from his shoulder, and when the on-block clip ejected with the famous metallic ping that every Garand owner has heard 1,000 times, 8 target markers had risen, and 7 of them showed X's, and the 8th showed a 10 just outside the X-ring by half an inch. With iron sights, at 78 years old, in a swirling crosswind, with a rifle older than any human being on that firing line. He had outshot every young man there, including Tyler, by a margin that the scorecards would later make almost embarrassing to read aloud. Walter laid the rifle down. He stood up slowly, because his knees were not what they had been in 1968, or in 1979, or even in 2010. He nodded once to Ray Baker. He walked over to Tyler, who was still staring at the target board, as though it had personally insulted him. The old man put a hand on the young shooter's shoulder, gently, the way a grandfather puts a hand on the shoulder of a grandson he loves. "Son," he said quietly, so that only Tyler could hear, "that rifle of yours is a fine rifle. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. But the man behind it matters more than the steel in front of him. Always has. Always will. Come find me at the next match. I'll show you how to read the wind without the meter. It's a thing the old shooters know. It's a thing worth learning." And then he walked back to lane 7, sat down on the bench, and began to clean his Garand the way he had cleaned it every Saturday afternoon since 1967. Tyler did not shoot his second relay that day. He sat on the bench behind his expensive rifle, and he stared at the prairie, and at one point one of the older spectators saw him wipe his eyes with the back of his hand and pretend that the wind had blown dust into them. 2 weeks later, Tyler drove out to Walter Hennessy's small house on the edge of Cedar Falls with a bag of fresh coffee and a notebook, and he asked the old man if he had meant the offer. Walter had meant it. They sat on the back porch for 3 hours that afternoon, and Walter taught Tyler how to read mirage without a spotting scope, how to feel wind on the back of his neck and translate that feeling into minutes of angle, how to call his shot before the bullet ever reached the target. Tyler came back the next Saturday, and the Saturday after that. By spring, 3 other young shooters were coming with him. By summer, Walter Hennessy was teaching a small, informal Saturday morning marksmanship class on his own back lawn, with a folding chair, a thermos of coffee, and a 1944 Garand on a sandbag, and word was beginning to spread quietly through the long-range shooting community in eastern Iowa. Ray Baker came to one of those classes in July. He brought his Distinguished Rifleman badge and laid it on the table next to Walter's coffee cup, and he said, "Sir, I want you to know something. The reason I earned this badge is because of you. Not directly. You never coached me face to face. But the manual you wrote was on my bunk for 2 years. I read it before every match. Some of the lines I have memorized, and I have spent 20 years wishing I could thank the man who wrote them. I just never knew his name." Walter Hennessy looked at the badge for a long time. Then he picked it up and handed it back to Ray. "You earned it, Gunny," he said. "Every man earns his own badge. I just wrote down what better men taught me, and you took the time to read it. That's all any of us ever does." There was a pause, and then Walter smiled. "Eleanor would have liked you," he said. "She always said the good ones come back to say thank you." Walter Hennessy passed away peacefully in his sleep 18 months later, on a quiet morning in spring, with the M1 Garand resting on a rack above the fireplace, exactly where his father had hung it in 1946. His funeral was attended by more than 400 people, including a Marine Corps Honor Guard, a delegation from Camp Perry, and 41 young shooters from across the upper Midwest who had, over the past 2 years, learned to shoot at his back porch class. Tyler delivered the eulogy. He spoke for 9 minutes about a man he had once dismissed as a grandfather who would never see the target. He said near the end, "Master Gunnery Sergeant Hennessy did not teach us to shoot. He taught us that the man behind the rifle matters more than the steel in front of him. He taught us that respect is not loud. He taught us that the people who built the things we use today are still walking among us, and that we will not always recognize them, and that the cost of failing to recognize them is a cost we will carry for the rest of our lives. I almost paid that cost. I am grateful every single day that he gave me the chance to learn instead." There was not a dry eye in the chapel. The Honor Guard fired 3 volleys, the bugler played taps, and somewhere in the second row, Ray Baker stood at attention with his Distinguished Rifleman badge pinned to his lapel, and he saluted the casket of the man who, more than any other, had taught him what it meant to be a shooter. The lesson of Walter Hennessy is older than any of us, and it will be true long after all of us are gone. The men and women who built the disciplines we practice, who wrote the manuals we read, who fought the wars that gave us the freedom to argue about rifle scopes on a Saturday morning. Those men and women are still here. They're quiet. They wear faded jackets and drive old trucks. They do not announce themselves, and the test of our character, the real test, is not whether we can shoot a 600-yard target with a $4,000 rifle. The test is whether we can recognize the man on the bench beside us and treat him with the respect he's already earned 1,000 times before we were born. If this story moved you, if you believe that the old veterans walking among us deserve more honor than they ask for and more attention than they receive, then please subscribe to this channel, because we tell these stories every week, and we tell them because the men and women they are about will not tell them about themselves. They never have. They never will. That is part of why they are who they are. Type honor in the comments one more time before you go, and the next time you see an old man on a rifle range with a battered Garand, you do what Tyler eventually learned to do. You take off your cap, you walk over, and you ask him very politely if he would be willing to teach you something, because the answer, more often than you would ever guess, is yes.